Welcome everyone, this is Andre's Restart, and today I would like to talk about cut content from Ocarina of Time making it into an eventual The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time remake. Now, this idea of an Ocarina of Time remake has been discussed at this point for a while. I have several videos on this idea. I've been referring to it as a theory. I believe eventually this game will be remade, and I think there's a chance we could see it within the next couple years for Nintendo's next generation console. And so this video is not talking about the likelihood of this happening or whether it is happening or not. There's already other videos on it, as I've already said, so you can check those out. This video is more so about talking about possible content we could be seeing in this potential remake. But when I think about how Nintendo has handled, say for example, Link's Awakening, first there's the original release on Game Boy, then the game was remastered with the deluxe version, the DX version, which came out for Game Boy Color, and there they added a color dungeon. And then when we talk about the remake, they also added a dungeon maker. And so there's a little bit of history where Nintendo takes a Zelda game, remasters it, adds some content, and then years later remakes it and adds more content. And so I think that's kind of what we're looking at here, possibly for Ocarina of Time. There was the original release, then it was remastered for Nintendo 3DS, and there was a number of quality of life updates. There is a boss rush mode added and new animations. And now we're talking about a remake where the game will be significantly visually enhanced, probably with more quality of life updates, and potentially with some new content or even some repurposed cut content. And so today what I wanted to do is look at some things that we've known were supposed to be in Ocarina of Time, or at least planned to be in Ocarina of Time at one point, that were cut, and sort of envisioning how that may work in this potential remake. Now before going forward, let me point out that we are aiming to reach 50,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Leaving a like is also super helpful, and enjoy the ride as we talk about Nintendo every day. So this idea of playing old games in a new way has been on my mind lately. So much so that literally this past night I had a dream about replaying Metroid Prime, but the way it worked in my dream, it was Metroid Prime Remastered, but I played it in a slightly different way and it led to very different results. And so obviously that's just a dream, likely because I've been thinking about this Ocarina of Time remake and repurposed old Nintendo games. But it does get me thinking in terms of how they might handle this potential remake. Because you look at modern Zelda games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the way these games are structured, you can do things pretty much however you please. There's a great deal of freedom, and in prior Zeldas they were far more restrictive. But when we take a look at Ocarina of Time specifically, there were some elements about that game that were a bit more open. So, for example, you could do either the Water or Fire Temple in either order, and the same can be said for Spirit and Shadow. So there was some flexibility in terms of how you would progress through the game. And so my thinking here is that if they were to remake Ocarina of Time, it's the one 3D Zelda game that they could do that in some ways could share more elements with the modern Zelda games, because they could redo it in a way where it will be even less restrictive and thus more similar to modern Zelda. But I don't believe that they're going to fully remake Ocarina of Time and say the Breath of the Wild engine. I think that's far too ambitious, and it kind of defeats the purpose of why this would make sense. It would make sense to do this because it would be a stopgap before the next major Zelda game years from now. It would be something that maybe the Zelda team might oversee, but another developer would be behind or be co-developing, and this would be mostly sticking to the source material here. But with that all said, something I can see happening is at least one more new dungeon. Very much in the same way how they added a new dungeon in the deluxe version of Link's Awakening, or even a dungeon maker later in the remake for Link's Awakening. I could see a dungeon being added to Ocarina of Time. And what's interesting about this is that when we take a look at a lot of the Spaceworld footage that's been repurposed from the leaked beta that we saw back then in '97, we see hints of a wind temple, we see hints of an ice temple. And now we know that these things were basically repurposed into the Forest Temple and the Water Temple respectively, but there was a point where these were considered. And there's even been a lot of conversation about there even being a Light Temple, for example. I always found it weird how when you would visit Rauru, when you become a child from adult, that you were just given the Light Medallion with no work required there. And so I wouldn't expect them to add a Wind Temple, an Ice Temple, and a Light Temple, 3 whole new dungeons. After all, the Forest and Water Temples are the Wind and Ice Temples, just repurposed. The Light Temple, though, I could definitely see. I could envision it as a trial, so you finally become an adult, and before you're allowed to venture out into this future world where everything is devastated and it's a lot harder, you need to prove that you've mastered your new older body, because you haven't been experiencing life in that older body. You just jumped from being a child to 7 years into the future, physically. So, you have to do the Light Temple, that functions very much as, say, for example, like the Tower of the Gods in the Wind Waker. It's a trial. And so I think this could be really cool without changing too much of the actual structure of the game. But on the note of the Light Medallion and also the Ice and Wind Temples that were cut, there's something we've seen from the recompiled Spaceworld footage that shows a mechanic that did not make it to the final game. And that's the medallions actually being useful outside of the story at the very end. We see that each of the 6 medallions can be used as a spell. They can be used kind of like Din's Fire, where you send out a shockwave pertaining to that particular element, or you can take that element and put it into your bow and arrow and then shoot it out. So this concept did make it to the final game. We have Din's Fire, where we can send out a fire shockwave, but just fire. And we do have the ability to create a fire arrow, an ice arrow, and a light arrow that do take up your magic. All of that does. But initially, it was meant to be more expansive. You would have 6 different elements to send out as a shockwave or through your bow and arrow. And the final game is just 1 and 3. So there's a significant difference there. And what I really like about this idea that they took out is that it made the medallions feel useful. The idea behind the medallions is the sage adding their power to you, them playing a role in your adventure, making you stronger, getting you ready to fight Ganondorf. But in practice, nothing like that actually really occurs. When you receive the medallion, you are physically the same. Nothing changes. The only thing the medallions do, as I said earlier, is that when you get to Ganon's castle, they can create a bridge, and they allow you to progress throughout the final dungeon. That's it. So this is something that I would like to see them add. Now, of course, if they were to do this, they might want to rethink some of the dungeons a little bit to make them feel a little bit more relevant, and then also perhaps offer a few more enemy types and varieties. That way you're sort of thinking a little bit more about when you're supposed to be using these spells. And I don't think it has to be that complicated, just perhaps maybe add in elemental varieties for the enemies that already exist. But on the note of enemies, an enemy that was not in Ocarina of Time that was cut, but made it into future Zelda games, including the one immediately after Majora's Mask, is the Choo-Choos. We see some footage of them where they look really simple, almost like just little blobs of colored goop, but these could have different elements, and they could be an enemy that would make these medallion abilities more relevant. Something else that's been noticed about Link and how he plays before the final version of the game is that combat seemed almost a little bit more fluid, as if he wasn't as restricted between his different attack chains. And so maybe they could go back to this idea and give Link a few more combat options. I'm not necessarily asking for anything significant, but maybe, for example, adding in the finishing strike, where Link jumps forward and presses down his sword into an enemy's chest when they're on the floor. If this is something they've added in future Zeldas, bringing it back into this potential remake might help it to feel a bit more modern and give Link just a little bit more he can do. There's even a cut animation where Link is pressing his sword down into the ground, so maybe there was something there. Another attack, though, I can see is the beam attacks. This is something that was cut from Ocarina of Time, likely to place more relevance on just the sword combat itself within this 3D space. This was a first 3D Zelda after all. But it's something that we see in the 2D Zelda games, it's something they brought back in the 3D Zelda games. I could see a beam attack being added as a upgrade late into the game. Very much the way it works in a lot of the modern Zeldas today. Now, between these different spells with the medallions and these new attack animations, they definitely would have to rework some of the fights. As I said, I think they should add in some new enemies, but I do think this would also mean that some of the dungeons would have to be remixed somewhat here. Maybe the boss fights have to be reassessed somewhat as well. Which I don't think is necessarily too much of a stretch because they were able to change the boss fights in Majora's Mask 3D, and what we're talking about here is something that would be even more ambitious. And if they are to be reworking things here to an extent, maybe they could revisit the idea of Link jumping. At one point, this was also considered, but was cut ultimately because they wanted to differentiate Mario 64 from Ocarina of Time. But this is no longer 1998, where they need to be worried about differentiating Mario 64 from Ocarina of Time and teaching people how to play 3D games for the very first time. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom now have Link using a jump button. Perhaps this is something that can be brought in as well. The ultimate idea here is making Ocarina of Time feel more like a modern game, restructuring the environment and the dungeons so they feel more fluid, less awkward, more intuitive, remixing the combat here, giving us a few more options, adding just a bit more content to make things interesting for those coming back who had played the original or even the remaster on 3DS. And this is how I could see some of the cut content from Ocarina of Time being reworked into a modern remake of this game. I wouldn't expect every little thing that was cut from Ocarina of Time to make it into this remake, say for example, like the older Great Fairy designs or the unicorn statue from the fountains. Some of these things were just meant to be cut. They were concepts that weren't the final versions, and they came up with better final versions when the game finally released. But still, seeing some of these ideas would be really cool in this potential remake. So maybe we see them sometime down the road. But what do you make of this idea of bringing back cut content into this potential Ocarina of Time remake? Let me know in the comments below. This is Andre's Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.